Invitational Rhetoric. You might be wondering why I assigned this reading to you. Considering this is argumentation course, or we're supposed to be studying argumentation, I assigned this thing called Invitational Rhetoric, not argumentative rhetoric, not invitational argumentation, anything like that. So you might be saying, why? Why is that? An invitational rhetoric, I think, is an interesting critique, a pretty valuable critique of the way we assume that things are supposed to go in terms of argumentation or rhetoric. And the relationship of argumentation and rhetoric should be pretty clear to you by now. Some of you have already written about it a little bit. There's the oral connection. Like when we argue, we're usually using our voice or our words and speaking to each other. There's also the idea that we are trying to persuade. Most people think of rhetoric as persuasion. I know that you don't, because you read Chris Tyndale's great stuff about how argumentation is not persuasion, and persuasion is too narrow of a way to think about what we're doing when we argue. I would say persuasion is too narrow of a thing to think about what we're doing when we're doing rhetoric. Rhetoric has a broad and big history of uses and abuses and meanings and thoughts about it all over the place. So I assign this because this unit, what we're looking at, is alternative conceptions of argumentation. And we have a lot of different ones that we've looked at. Probably the most popular one is going to be about visual images, where we're going to read a little bit on that. There's a lot more to read about that. We just don't have time to cover. But today, in this talk, I'm going to talk about invitational rhetoric, which is, I think, we have to start here. So this, let's see, we're going to move this to the top. That's the syllabus again. The syllabus always makes an appearance. There we go. So this essay is what we're going to be looking at today. And in order to go into detail on that, I thought I would do something it might be kind of funny, but a long time ago there's this program called Prezi, and my students were using it to make really cool PowerPoint presentations, and I wanted in on it. So I said, will you show me how to use Prezi? And they said, yeah, sure. So I made a couple of Prezi presentations, and the students told me to stop because they got motion sick and they didn't really like what I was doing with it. But it's kind of an animated PowerPoint. So I have one on this essay that I think I'm going to share with you because I think it's a pretty good take you through of the most important quotes in the essay. But this essay is often thought of as a kind of a feminist rhetorical theory, and I'm not sure what that might mean. Feminism is one of these things where there are so many writers and so many authors and so many aspects to it. It's sort of like when you say something like science. Well, what do you mean by that? And when people start to talk about it, you get more of a sense of what they mean by saying like, well, we should all believe in science. Or I am a spiritual person. Well, what does that mean? So when someone says I'm a feminist, our usual reaction is to respond immediately to the parts of it that we hate. But we don't do that when someone says, I believe in science, or I commit myself to a scientific point of view. We don't do that. When we hear somebody say something is feminist or that they are a feminist, we shouldn't react with the worst possible traits, right? We should think about what attracted them to it and what might be the tenets that they are interested in. If we don't know enough, we should go and, of course, read more about it or ask them what they read that convinced them to do it. And of course, if they haven't read anything, if they just got the idea off of TV or something, it might not be worth talking about. But a lot of times it is worth talking about because it's based on human experiences that have shaped their mind and shaped their point of view, and that's always worth investigating. That's what we're supposed to do in a democracy, is argue with each other and try to figure out what the reasons are behind what people think and how they feel and how they approach the world. So this essay was based on this essay, which I didn't, I disappeared myself. There it is. It's based on this essay, which this essay is one that sort of says a lot of the strong things that invitational rhetoric is critiqued for saying. Womanization of Rhetoric by Gerhardt. This is the essay that invitational rhetoric is sort of trying to find a practical or a pragmatic way of doing. So Gerhardt, in this essay, talks about how the idea that rhetoric is persuasion is a philosophy of domination, control, occupation, and discipline that we might be better off without. And she makes the argument through a lot of different traditions, an ecological tradition and a feminist tradition. And it's quite an interesting essay. I didn't assign it because it gets us a little off the track for what we're trying to do. But if you want to read it, I can post it in Discord for you. But Womanization of Rhetoric was an essay that says rhetoric is something we'd be better off without because it dominates. It assumes that you know best. Like when you go and try to persuade somebody, you're saying implicitly, I know what you should feel, think, do, or believe. Now that's in there, regardless of what you think persuasion is. It might be trying to improve people's lives, but you do have to admit that's kind of in there. So then you have to admit that rhetoric is kind of a type of violence because you're stepping into somebody's life and saying, you need to change. And maybe there's something wrong with that. Maybe that's some kind of a verbal colonization. Maybe that's some kind of a verbal manipulation or attack on somebody. So this is considered to be one of the many feminist critiques of rhetoric as a whole in saying we should replace it with something else. Maybe we didn't have it. We shouldn't have rhetoric as persuasion. We should have it as maybe a shared collective of experiences or something. But the real alternative to the problem of rhetoric comes out in the other essay, Invitational Rhetoric. Now, when this essay was published, it caused quite a stir. And a lot of people really get upset about this essay. And I don't understand why. More about that kind of at the end of the talk. But a lot of people feel like this is a full-on assault on rhetoric and that rhetoric is bad. And rhetoric is terrible and we should sit in a circle and sing songs together and hold hands. And that's what rhetoric should be, is a sharing of perspective. And I think that's a bit of a straw person of the article. I think people just don't like the article and they can't explain why, or they don't have any good reasons why. I haven't read a lot of the critiques. I've read a few of them. I haven't read any that make a lot of sense because most of the critiques say, but why not do this other kind of rhetoric? Okay. I mean, there's nothing in here that says that you have to do what they're saying all the time. I think that's the big problem with the critiques of this. This is the essay that says we shouldn't have rhetoric. So this is the one that I think ought to be engaged critically from that point of view. This one doesn't say that. This one says here's an addition to the rhetorical canon of ways of getting what we want. When we engage in rhetoric, we're trying to change something. So maybe telling somebody what to do or trying to hit them with a bunch of evidence and say, here are the facts, and why are you ignoring the facts? why aren't you doing what's best for you? It might not be the best way to do it. There might be something ethically wrong with that. And sometimes there is. Sometimes it's perfectly fine. But this essay makes no claim that there's only one way to do it. And I think that's an important caveat before we get into the dizzying presentation that I have for you today. Okay, let's see if I can find it. That's what we're looking at right now. So I have a pretty nice Prezi here. Somewhere. Okay, there it is. So I just need to go over here to this and pull it up. And it should be on the screen now. Okay, great. So I think that this is actually a pretty good presentation I made. I'm not proud of a lot of these presentations I made, but let's go through it and see if we can understand what invitational rhetoric is, how they define it, and what its application is to us in studying argumentation. Now remember, they're going to propose a different way of doing what we might consider argumentation. The question is, how much overlap is rhetoric and argumentation? How much do they share? Now, you already kind of know the answer to this because you've been reading Chris Tyndale's book, and the answer is people choose how much overlap there is, and most people in argumentation say very little. It's almost an afterthought in the tradition of studying argumentation. In American rhetoric communication studies, it's nearly 100% is rhetoric with a little bit of other, a little bit of kind of logic, philosophy, and maybe some law in there too. So that's an interesting difference, isn't it? You can kind of start wherever you want. You know that starting with rhetoric means you start with the audience. So you kind of build something together. And in fact, Tyndale cites this piece, this invitational rhetoric essay, a couple of times in the textbook. I don't know if you might have noticed that. But you can go to the references and see that already in a couple of chapters he's done that. All right, so let's see if I'm gonna make you guys ill or what here. I don't know. But let's try it. Let's see what happens with Prezi here. So these are all quotes from the essay, and I'll try to explain what they're saying as we go. Okay, so they are critical of the fact that the root definition of rhetoric has been we want to change other people, and they call that a patriarchal bias. Does that mean you can never do it? Is it bad? Well, it's bad if you think that's the only way that you can reach other people and change their mind. It's trying to change other people's mind. Trying to change other people is patriarchal control, domination. Maybe not the most ethical way to approach other people. So they say that the idea of thinking of rhetoric as persuasion is too limited, and maybe we ought to think of it another way. Instead of saying, well, rhetoric is using evidence and arguments to change people's minds. Maybe there's another way to do it that doesn't fall into the trap of that bias. And it's important to note that bias doesn't have to be conscious. It can be structurally in the art of trying to persuade somebody or change their mind. It can be part of the structure of it is that it's okay or even a positive good for me to enter somebody's life and change what they're doing. I mean, where's the justification for that on its own? Contextually, I can see a lot of that. But where is that on its own? Is that an operation we'd want to support? Okay, so this quote indicates that what they are trying to do, I hope you can read all this. Let me look and make sure I'm not in the way. Okay, yeah, very good. So they talk about how when you do this, when you're the rhetor, when you're speaking and you're saying, here's what you need to do, you should stop believing this, here's who you should vote for, you're trying to exercise power over them, kind of force them to do something, make them do something. But then also it devalues their life and perspective. They have a point of view that you're not even asking about. So these are systems that people have created through their own human experiences, and you've decided, not knowing what their experiences are, that these need to be changed, and you're going to tell them to change it and persuade them to do that. And that's bad because it devalues individual perspectives or other perspectives, and there might be some value in seeing several different perspectives on an issue. We'll get to that in a minute. Yep, so this is kind of something we think about. If somebody's going to argue or debate, we always assume that they know more than the audience, and if their views are different than ours, then their view is probably more expert, just because of the fact that they're able to present to an audience in this formal way. We might not think that about the presidential debates. I don't know. Maybe. But it's often thought of as like if somebody says something in a debate on a stage in front of an audience, that even if you think that is not necessarily true, people are going to more lean that way. So there's a lot of performative structured things going on here. This is a big quote. So they pick a very mundane example here. Let's say you're saying, oh, no, you should take this class. You just interject into somebody who's saying, oh, I might take this, I might take that. No, you got to take this. Now, even in that moment, you're taking control of somebody else's life in a way that might not be ethically appropriate. You don't know this person that well at all. And although there are some things that are universal between human beings about how we perceive things, I would say There's some things that are at least maybe not universal, but we can connect that are in common. People spend a lot of their lives trying to say, oh no, you shouldn't eat that. Oh no, you shouldn't go there. You shouldn't listen to that music. No, you shouldn't like these kind of films. You shouldn't dress that way. People spend a lot of their lives trying to control other people. And even if they don't have even if they don't change them, these moments of attempting of persuasive control don't really benefit you. You're just doing it in order to influence and control others. So it's just become a part of our society that isn't necessarily good, and in fact might be harmful, because you're not attending to the fact that people have decided things about their life based on their experiences. It might be good to know some of those experiences has nothing to do with you. So here's the summary of what it is. Efforts to change others and gain control over them. Self-worth derived from and measured by the power exerted over others. Yeah, I'm very good at debate. I'm very good at persuading other people. I'm very good at arguing. Self-worth based on making other people do things. That's kind of what they're saying. A devaluation of the life worlds of others, which comes with that. Like, they might have reasons that don't make sense, but their mind has put together a method of moving through the world that maybe you don't respect it, maybe you don't think it's good, but at least it deserves some care. And most of the time when we're trying to persuade, we don't offer that care. It's a rhetoric of patriarchy reflecting its values of change, competition, domination, but these are not the only values on which a rhetorical system can be constructed, and we would like to propose one alternative, a feminist rhetoric. So they're using feminist as the opposite of patriarchal. And patriarchy is a very complex idea. I don't know if I can really do it justice here, but patriarchy has a lot of values that come from things like one person should be in charge. There is one truth or one way of knowing. There's one kind of knowledge. There's lots of different things that we could say are patriarchal ideas. And feminist in this case, now notice it doesn't have anything to do with being a woman or a man. It has to do with systemic control and the structures that we don't interrogate, structures of right and wrong that we don't question. So they're going to say, we've revealed the structure to have these elements. We're going to propose an alternative to that structure. And even though they're dragging rhetoric pretty hard here, they're not going to say we have to throw it away. So the rhetoric they're going to describe as something people do already. It's inductive. That means it exists in the world already. And they're going to try to formalize it through the paper, through their argument. They're not coming up with something in a lab, making out of parts or chemicals. They're like, we have observed people using this. The grounding of its assumptions is what makes it feminist. I already talked about that a little bit. And it's going to expand options to rhetors. And that's what's, I think, odd about this is the study of rhetoric is a study of modes of persuasion and communication and meaning making. I always say meaning making. What would be so bad about having another way to make meaning with people to get them to understand something or to get them to maybe entertain accepting a proposition? What would be so bad about that? But people attack this theory all the time. I think having an extra option, even if you don't ever want to use it, is fine. It doesn't hurt anything. You don't have to use it. So they say that that's the one advantage of it. And also that they can create a more systematic effort to describe more rhetorical instances. And what they're pointing at here is that rhetoric really only looks at oral speech at this point in time. That's still the primary thing rhetoric looks at. But now I'd say rhetoric looks at TV shows, buildings, comic books. Rhetoricians study everything. They study essays. They do everything. So they're trying to expand it to things that we might not traditionally think of as rhetoric, because the man speaking at a podium, the presidential address, the congressional address, that seems to be the gold standard in a lot of rhetorical work for a lot of people, and they kind of want us to think away from that model. All right, so they're looking at three principles for invitational rhetoric: equality, imminent value, and self-determination. Those are the starting places for a new rhetoric. Now, they say new, not a replacement, new rhetoric. These principles are one that explicitly challenge the positive value the patriarchy accords to changing and thus dominating others. So they're like, could we have a rhetorical theory based on these principles? Self-determination, imminent value, and equality. That's what they're going to try to do in the essay. And they have a lot of examples, which I think are pretty cool examples. We'll talk about those as we get to them. But the important thing to know at this point is that they're saying, we're going to see if we can create a workable rhetorical theory that's not based on the patriarchal values we just identified: controlling other people's lives, being proud that you're able to change people's minds, interference with others' lives, and not listening to their stories, assuming they just don't know and they need to be persuaded what to do. Among the feminist principles on which our proposed rhetoric is based is a commitment to the creation of relationships of equality and to the elimination of the dominance and elitism that characterize most human relationships. So now we're going broader, which is most human relationships are characterized by elitism. We're better than this other group? Who's better in this group than this other person? We're trying to be equal. We're trying to create equality here. And that's what they're trying to do. We want to make relationships. We don't want to create an elite group, a special group, and we don't want to celebrate domination over others. You can see why my students probably hated this presentation, right? It's kind of spins a lot. I think I was a little excited about Prezi. I was a little bored with PowerPoint. Another principle that undergirds most feminisms is a recognition of the immanent value of all living beings. The essence of this principle is that every being is a unique and necessary pattern of the universe and thus has value. So that's pretty extreme. They say because of the fact that you exist, you have automatic immanent value. And so they're saying the rhetorical theory should recognize that and take that into account. Just because you exist, you have value, and that you're necessary to the structure of the universe. You're a necessary node. There's no throwaway people. And that's important for what they're going to do later. Self-determination, a third principle that typically compromises a feminist worldview grounded in respect for others. Okay, so basically they're saying that everybody is an authority on their own life. You can make your own decision, and you have the right to constitute the world as you so choose, because I cannot say that you had or did not have an experience. It's a weird thing to say, right? Let's think about that. If somebody says that they felt like their life was in danger, does their life have to be in danger in a very objective way for that to be true, for that to impact their life? What if they say, growing up, we didn't have a lot of food security. I didn't know where my next meal was going to come from. Let's say you know somebody who had it worse. They describe what that means. They say, oh, well, sometimes we didn't have meat or da-da-da-da-da. And you say, well, I know people who have it a lot worse than that, who weren't able to eat for days. Does that make their experience fake, less influential or important in the way they see the world? Who are you to say? Who are you to say? The idea here is that people are having these experiences and reacting to them in a human way. That deserves respect, and it's something that should be folded into a rhetorical theory, is to say there's no wrong way to constitute the world based on human experience. That doesn't mean people can't change their mind. That doesn't mean that people can't be influenced. That doesn't mean that people can't listen and accept other views. But what it does mean is you can't go in and say, oh yeah, that's idiotic. Here's the way you really should think about that. Your life wasn't really in danger. Come on. You weren't really abused. I mean, we hear this discourse all the time, right? You weren't really abused. It's not really that serious of an issue, is it? People do that all the time. It's that desire to control others and to control the narrative of what's right, which might be an unethical way to approach people. So they think, now here's the important part here. Read that. Although we believe that persuasion is often necessary, we believe that an alternative exists that may be used in instances when changing and controlling others is not the rhetoric's goal. So right here, they're explicitly saying, look, the other way of doing it, even though it's based on patriarchal values, and that might not be the best thing in the world, still something that has to be done from time to time. It's something that we don't really like the values, but it's still fine to use. But it's not a one-stop shop. It's not a one-size-fits-all solution. We're going to try to build on other kinds of principles and make something different. An invitation to understanding it means to create a relationship rooted in these three values. It's an invitation to the audience to enter the rhetor's world and see it as the rhetor does. That's kind of cool. This sounds like what we're studying in argumentation in Tyndale's book of rhetorical argumentation, is that the good arguer invites you to see things in their way. This is also like Douglas Inninger's work, right? That you invite them in, you invite them to see it that way. and try to sort of act as the corrector, and then they correct back. So it's very equal. It's very equal. It's very sort of on the same level. You're not telling people how to do things or that their thoughts are wrong. You're saying, here's how I see it. And this creates a relationship based on values that wouldn't be rejected. You know what's interesting? Somebody should take those values, put them up against Integer's values, and see if there's really a threat to traditional debate and rhetoric here. I don't think that there is. I don't think there's any threat at all. I think that threat is overblown. I think people feel threatened by this essay, and they feel like it's attacking rhetoric in ways they don't like. They don't like to hear that rhetoric is essentially violent. Instead of saying, well, maybe it's not essentially anything. Maybe as rhetoricians, there's lots of different understandings of what rhetoric is that we would draw on for different purposes in different contexts. Kind of the way I take the position to be that there's no firm understanding of these things, but in different situations, different things might be called for. And I feel that's perfectly in line with what Foss and Griffin are arguing here. In presenting a particular perspective, the invitational rhetor does not judge or denigrate others' perspectives, but is open to and tries to appreciate and validate those perspectives, even if they differ dramatically from the rhetoric's own. So you're not saying this is the wrong way to think, these people are evil or bad. You're trying not to judge and offering an alternative way of viewing something. So they listen, they try to understand, and then they present their own. Now this seems like hard to do if you have an audience of 100 people, and I think that might be the real critique of it, is that invitational rhetoric can only be used in smaller groups. But you try to listen and you say, well, here's what I think, or here's my perspective. But then you worry about someone kind of taking over the 100-person audience and kind of monopolizing it, telling their story. But done in a way that's measured, where people respect the time limits and respect what's possible. Everyone gets a little bit of a better understanding of the issue. There might be a way to do this through writing, where you can have people say, express your own view and compare it to what you've heard. And then they can kind of appreciate it. And that might kind of create a different viewpoint for them by merging their worldview with what the speaker is saying. And saying, well, these things are kind of, I agree with, and these things I kind of don't. It's not just an understanding, though. We're not just saying, oh, well, that's how they see it. So like one of the ways this rhetorical theory is trivialized, or this argument style is trivialized, is saying, oh, that's just one way of understanding the issue. That's the way that speaker understands it. That's great. I got it. I'm moving on. But the framework of it is that they understand their own views in a different way because of the way they approached the speaker's views. So since these principles are forwarded, there's this kind of nice re-understanding of it. So this is kind of the way I like to think about argument, is that you have an argument with somebody. It might not necessarily be a time to force them to change their mind. Instead, it might be a time to find new ways to support your own view and alter it in just a little bit of a way, but it might not alter at all. But the reasons why you support your view might alter, and I think it's very valuable to open it up to that rather than saying, well, you either agree or you disagree, or you're wrong, we're right. That kind of a simplistic view of rhetorical situations, right? So in invitational rhetoric, you don't claim that you're superior, you have more knowledge, or that you have the right answer, and you're not going to impose your perspective. You're going to say, and not in a tricky way, you're going to say, this is the view I want to share, and I'd like to hear your views on this as well, and maybe somehow we can come together on this. What a weird kind of way to argue, huh? Because I think this is kind of an alternative way of doing an argument. I mean, I know it's rhetoric, but they're definitely not talking about like ceremonial speaking or informative speaking. They're not talking about that, or, oratory that is just symbolic. They're not really talking about that, like purely done for the sake of that it needs to be done. What they're talking about is that they're saying it's time for people to make free decisions. And the appreciation of other perspectives that are maybe different leads to equality, respect, and appreciation. I think it's interesting to think that if somebody presents a different point of view, our initial reaction is to find weaknesses in it and try to argue back against it. But what they're suggesting we do is to say, well, it's just simply different. Let's not denigrate it. Let's listen to it as we would someone trying to argue with us. So it really kind of confuses the role of the rhetor in the audience, or the arguer in the audience. So openness. Do you think you can win an argument by being completely open to your audience? Do you think that if you're completely open to your audience, that the function of arguing is to win at that point? Or is it something else? I really like this Prezi. I might make some more Prezis. This is pretty cool, huh? You can leave a comment if you like it or don't like it. I'll read them all. Change may be the result of invitational rhetoric, but change is not its purpose. Okay, now we're getting more into the Chris Tyndale stuff, right? When change does occur as a result of understanding, it is different from the kind of change that typifies the persuasive interactions of traditional rhetoric. So people do change in invitational rhetoric, but it's not because they were persuaded by a rhetor who knew more than them and pushed them to do it, and they feel like they've changed because that person persuaded them to. That's not what they want. So change is what they're going to attack next. So change is a shift in the audience requested by the rhetor. I want you to vote for so-and-so. And people go and do it, then I have made them do that. I have persuaded them to do that. I am a successful speaker. I persuaded them to believe that. So the change does not come from that in invitational rhetoric. It comes from a new understanding or insights gained in the exchange. So it doesn't come from the rhetor or the audience. It comes from somewhere else. This might be very similar to rhetorical argument, the way Tyndale is structuring it, where it's not that somebody wins or loses, but in different relationship forms between that exchange and some other third way appears that then becomes something worth investigating, agreeing with, or denying. Then also don't discount how powerful it is to reassess your own reasons for a position and come up with better reasons for it, which is one of the reasons why one would want to argue and debate. So this is kind of weird, right? So this kind of argumentation model, if you think about it, is they're going to be discovering, questioning, comparing things. It sounds like breakout sessions. So we're comparing things. I wonder how this would work if you had a big audience. That's one of the questions I wonder about. Like, how would you do this in a way if you're like doing a TED Talk and you're trying to advance an argument? How could you be invitational there? Maybe you wouldn't want to be. Maybe that would be one of the places you wouldn't be. But maybe if you're in a group of 20 people, how could you do it and say, well, what are your views? What are your points of view? And let's all discover the different points of view. So it sounds like the initial argument, the advancement of the initial position, is really just an invitation for the advancement of X number of positions in the room, whoever wants to share, and then those positions interact in a way that creates a groundwork for understanding and then change. It seems like what they're saying. You might choose to be changed because you like what someone says. And that can happen when you're like, oh man, I really like the way you defended that point. I'm going to think about that. That's a good reason to defend it. You might already believe it, but now you have a better reason to believe it. I think that's very valuable. And the rhetor focuses people onto understanding by everyone, about the issue and each other. So it's a broadened understanding of the issue and each other. Instead of saying, well, there's just one way to solve violence in this part of the world or whatever. It's like, what are the roots of this and how do we understand it and how can we relate it to the violence in our everyday life? And, you go on and on and on and get a much deeper an understanding of the issue that really doesn't have any kind of circular limit. It can continue to expand in a way that the more it expands, the more things you have to consider and think about in terms of an issue. Which might be another critique of this is you can't really use this to solve a pressing problem because every time if you're doing it correctly, you're always pushing the point of decision away across the horizon and you're always continuously understanding because there's no point where you would just be like, okay, I understand now. Because at that point you're risking, doing violence to other perspectives. So at some point you do have to call it and say, I guess each group could say, yeah, we're comfortable. We've explored everyone's diverse point of view and we've heard it and we have enough to go on now. Maybe. Individual perspectives are articulated in individual rhetoric as carefully, completely, and passionately as possible to give them full expression, to invite their careful consideration by the participants in the action. This reminds me of the pragma-dialectical theory where you're supposed to use a lot of usage declaratives, right? You're saying, here's what I mean. Here's why I said that. Here's what this is meant to do. You're being very transparent and clear about your language. You're not being snooty or clever or being an edgelord. None of that kind of stuff that you think makes good debate where you're snooty and you make clever remarks. None of that is valuable in these models of argumentation, because what you're trying to do is reach some kind of relationship, right? This articulation occurs not through persuasive argument, but through offering the giving of expression to a perspective without advocating its support or seeking its acceptance. Here's how I think about that. Here is the conclusion I drew, and you provide it as a narrative, not as a here's the conclusion you should draw. That's the important difference in invitational rhetoric and traditional rhetoric. You offer it. I offer my way of working through this to you. Here's how I came to know this. Here's what my world is like. Here's what's in it. And here's the results of what I did or what I believe. Here's how it's changed me. So they say they tried to write the essay using such features of it. And they're proposing it. And again, they say this is one of many equally legitimate perspectives possible. Not only does that mean that regular old rhetoric or traditional argumentation is fine and doesn't need to be wiped off the face of the earth, but there might also be other interpretations of invitational rhetoric that they would want to listen to and accept without judgment, because it would have the potential to offer them the opportunity to change. It's not the only appropriate form of rhetoric. It should not be used in all situations. Traditional theories of rhetoric are very useful and great, and this is an alternative which will then build upon and offer more ways to see more things as rhetorical or as worth the study of rhetoric, rather than saying they're misguided, they're inaccurate, they're bad. So now we're going to get into some things that rhetorics can do. Resourcement. Resourcement is that you bring in another perspective that is not your own and that is not the issue or the perspective you've heard, but sort of another one that comes in that's relevant, that can broaden or make acceptable or understandable both perspectives in an argument. And so anytime you are doing this kind of argumentation or this kind of rhetoric, you have to promote safety, value, and freedom. And this oftentimes nowadays sounds to me like when people ask for not free speech zones, but they ask for safe zones on campus. Have you guys heard about these kind of arguments? Safe zones? Like a place where I can express my views and I'm not going to be attacked, or I'm not going to be called to defend political views. That's kind of what invitational rhetoric is saying, is that they want to create a rhetorical safe zone where these things are valued much, much higher than winning the debate, owning the libs, showing that all their evidence is from a biased, corrupt, horrible source. Your evidence is from corporate America, you loser. This kind of stuff. They want people to understand the points of view and perspectives, and that human experience is a valuable motive and should be a valued mode of evidence. Okay, so the value of adding this to rhetoric is that, guess what? Well, now we have another way to think about rhetoric. It's not about persuasion. It's about broadening understanding and creating relationships. So that changes the kind of things that we could study in rhetoric. And also it changes, for us looking at argumentation, it really changes what we could think of as arguments. Because if rhetoric's kind of simplistic understanding is its persuasion, argument's simplistic understanding is that it's meant to persuade or meant to prove somebody wrong. What if we made invitational argumentation under these same goals? Well, now we have a lot more things that we can call argument that we can research and participate in. So it can also serve as a way to help scholars develop cooperative, non-adversarial, and ethical communication. And people are working on these kind of research questions, and maybe this model will help them say, hey, here's a place where we saw rhetoric happening that wouldn't have been defined that way by earlier theories. Now we have a way to identify it and name it. It also allows a heuristic inventive function, which means that if I'm working on an argument and trying to create an argument and trying to craft it, I'm always limited by my assumptions about what an argument can be. And those assumptions might not be known to me. They might be from society or even from how I was raised. And it takes a lot of study and a lot of years to really be able to nail down and look at your ideology, the things that you think are natural, normal, good, and undeniable and irrefutable things. I think those things are incredibly hard to get your finger on. And I think that if you broaden out what the conception of rhetoric is, now you have more things to invent. Or if you broaden out what an argument can be or what the situations of argument look like, now you can bring out a lot more things that you can do to create arguments. So they're talking about the teaching function here, about when we're making arguments, this has a value. And it also allows a kind of a resistance to allow people to transform systems of domination and oppression. It seems pretty weak, but the thing is that most of the time, actual rhetoric that can change minds or move people happens in certain kinds of forms that can be transmitted and are thought of as legitimate because of how they are shaped and looked. What they're suggesting here is that this is a way to change things by not having to warp yourself or compromise in order to gain access to those positions of power. So when you confront people who support the oppressive system, whether it benefits them or not, this allows you a way to show them what it's like to argue and to discuss under a different value system than what they're used to. I think the example they use for that is the example when I think they talk about a nuclear protest where the police brought everyone into the room and then they were chanting and dancing in a way that the police didn't really know what to make of. They all did these kind of chants and sang, and they really weren't sure what to make of that. So, would you ever want to use this? Have we been using it so far? I think Tyndale is probably the place. If you want to write about this, Tyndale would be the place to look because he's citing them. I think he does it a couple of times in chapter 2, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, how does it differ from rhetoric itself? I mean, it's a good question. Something to think about. Or for you, argumentation. Can you use it in your next assignment? Well, could you write a paper or do a recording for the next unit where you actually try to employ this and try to make it happen the way that they suggest? Kind of an interesting thing to think about. Would you have to make a compromise? Would it be better in some way? More importantly, would I like it? Would it work? I guess that's what it is for that one. So yeah, hope you weren't made too ill with that. Invitational rhetoric. What do you think about it? That's a good summary of some of the most important parts of the essay. Remember, they are talking about argumentation. In a way, rhetoric and argumentation have a tight history in the United States. Very close history in the United States. In Europe, not so much. But when you look at the European stuff we've been reading, you can see automatically that they're approaching argumentation from philosophy. When you approach it this way, you have a very different way of talking about it, a very different way of approaching it. So I'm curious about your thoughts about invitational rhetoric. Leave a comment, ask a question, talk to me in Discord about it, and I will invite you to do that. I don't think it's invitational rhetoric, and it's probably cheesy, but I hope this gave you a little bit of a better understanding of Faustin Griffin's theory of invitational rhetoric, which just had its 30th anniversary, and they just put out a book. It's over here on my shelf, Inviting Understanding. It's great. I have an essay in there, and lots of other smart people, smarter than me, have essays in there. It's a wonderful resource, so check it out. Okay, so that's it for this talk, and I hope you enjoyed it, and watch another video if you like this one.